Students, welcome to Sunil's tutorial. I'm Sunil Milwani and today we'll be doing this chapter called as nervous coordination. Let's see what is reflex action. What do we understand by reflex action? Now, reflex action is automatic, sudden and rapid unconscious motor response to a stimulus without the knowledge of the brain. Right? It is an automatic. It is an automatic. Sudden and rapid unconscious motor response to a stimulus without the knowledge of the brain. Without the knowledge of the brain. Right? That is what is reflex action. Now, why do I need to have reflex action? So, if you have something thrown at you, your eyes would automatically blink and you would try to move ahead or move aside. Right? That is your reflex action. Question: why do I need reflex action, or what is the importance of reflex action? Let us see the importance of reflex action. Reflex action gives quick response to stimulus without the knowledge of the brain and adjusts the animal to changing environment. It gives quick response to the stimulus. It gives quick response to the stimulus without the knowledge of the brain. Without the knowledge of the brain. Without the knowledge of the brain to adjust the animal to the changing environment. Fine. Now, reflex action also helps an organism to escape from danger and save their lives. So, thus it is also a protective function. It helps an organism to escape from danger and save their life. Right? Thus, it is protective in function. It is protective in function. Right? Next, reflex action gives relief to the brain, and most of the reflex action are from spinal reflexes. Reflex action gives relief to the brain. Reflex action gives relief to the brain, as most of the reflex action actions are from spinal reflexes or spinal reflexes. Right? Next, reflex action helps in the survival of animal from unexpected situation. Reflex action helps in the survival of an animal from unexpected situations. Fine. So that is my importance of reflex action. Now let us see the path of reflex action. Let us see the path of reflex action, which is also called as the reflex arc. So what is reflex arc? It is the path through which the mechanism of reflex action takes place. Right? Reflex arcs. Reflex arc is a path through which the mechanism of reflex action takes place. Fine. The various components of reflex arc are first, now let's see this. You have the receptor organ. Receptor organ is the sensory organ. Next, you have sensory neuron. Which is afferent neuron. Next, you have adjuster neuron. Right, which is called as associated neuron. And then you have motor neuron, which is efferent neuron, and finally you have efferent organ. Right, that's your motor organ. So all these components are required for a reflex action. Now let's see the diagram of reflex action and let's see how a reflex arc takes place. Let's see the reflex path. Now, first of all, you need to have a receptor organ. A receptor organ can be any one of the sensory organs such as skin, eyes, nose, tongue or ears. The sensory neurons, this is my sense organ, here is my sense organ, okay. So your reflex path is going to start from the sense organ. The sensory neuron present in the dorsal root ganglion are present in the dorsal root ganglion. It's dendron. Guys, can we see this? You have two parts. One is called as the axon, one is called as the dendron. So its dendron is connected to the receptor organ. Right? The dendron is connected to the receptor organ, which receives the impulse, while the axon is connected to the dendron of the adjuster neuron to transmit the impulse. So you have here, you have the sensory organ, you have from the receptor organ, you have the dendron that is connected to it, and the axon. Here is the axon. No, this is the cyton, and then the axon is then connected to the dendron of the adjuster neuron. So you have impulse that is generated here is then carried in to the dorsal root ganglion of the sensory neuron, right? So the first thing that you have is the impulse being carried to the agester neuron, right? So the next is the agester neuron. The agester neuron is present in the dorsal horn. Here's the dorsal horn. Is present in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. It lies in between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron and is linked with sensory and motor neuron by synapse. Here I'll show you how it is there. Here you have this empty space here. So it is going to be linked. Here is that empty space. Synapse. So here what is that synapse? It is nothing but it is the agester neuron which lies between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron. Here is the sensory neuron, here is the motor neuron, and this is the agester neuron which lies between the sensory and the motor neuron. Fine? And it is present inside the dorsal horn of it is present inside the dorsal horn of the gray matter, and it is linked with both the neurons with the help of synapse. What is its function? Its function is to transmit impulses to motor neuron from sensory neuron. So whatever impulse is received from the sensory neuron, it just transmits it here to the motor neuron, right? The motor neuron is the efferent neuron. Again, it is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Its dendron forms a synapse with the axon of the agester neuron, and it transmits impulses from here. It is going to transmit this impulse here to the motor organ, to the efferent organ or the motor organ through the axon. Fine. And finally you have the efferent organ. The efferent organ is the muscle gland that gives response to the stimuli. So let's go over this once again, guys. You will have a stimulus that will be given to the receptor organ. So here is your receptor organ, right? The receptor organ is going to, you have the sensory neuron that is present. This is my sensory neuron. This whole thing from here to here, right? The sensory neuron is present in the dorsal root ganglion. It is connected to the receptor neuron. Sorry, it is its dendron is connected to the receptor organ, whereas its axon is connected to the agester neuron. So dendron is connected over here and axon is connected to the agester neuron. The agester neuron lies inside the gray matter. It connects both the sensory neuron and the motor neuron with the help of synapse, right? It only passes impulses from sensory neuron to the motor neuron. The motor neuron then is again located in the spinal cord. It is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Its dendron is connected to the agester neuron, whereas its axon is connected to the motor organ. And then motor organ is the organ that will create the response to the stimulus. Fine, do we get this thing clear? Now, let's come to this part which is called as the synapse. What is the synapse? Synapse is a microscopic gap between the axon of one neuron and the dendron of another neuron, which is present in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Synapse helps in transmitting impulses from one neuron to another neuron. Fine. The axon of a neuron manufactures a neurohormone which fills this gap for the impulse. This is going to manufacture a neurohormone which will fill the gap and transmit the impulse. The enzyme, you have an enzyme which neutralizes this neurohormone, and thus it prevents the lingering of that effect of the impulse. Right? So that's how impulses are transmitted. Let's write this down. We've seen the part of the reflex action. Let's see how does the reflex action. Let's write about all the organs of the reflex action. You have the first you have is receptor organs. Receptor organs, right? Receptor organ, it is any one of the sensory organ. It is any one of the sensory organ. It is any one of the sensory organ. Um, it is any one of the sensory organs such as skin, eyes, nose, ears, and tongue. Such as skin, eyes, nose, tongue, and ears. Right? So that was the first thing, that is you will need to have a receptor organ where you are going to receive the stimulus, right? Once you have that, then you need to have the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is also called as the afferent neuron, right? The sensory neuron is also called as the afferent neuron. Right? I could call this as my sensory neuron or the afferent neuron. Now what does it do? Sensory neuron, it is present in the dorsal root ganglion. It is present in the dorsal root ganglion. It is present in the dorsal root ganglion. Its dendron is connected with the receptor organs to receive the impulses while its axon is connected to the dendron of the agester neuron, to transmit the impulse. Right? So that's my sensory neuron. The next thing that you have is agester neuron. Right? It is present in the dorsal horn of the grey matter. It is present in the dorsal horn of the grey matter. It is present in the dorsal horn of the grey matter. It lies between the motor neuron and sensory neuron. It lies between motor neuron and sensory neuron, and is linked with sensory and motor neuron, with sensory and motor neurons through synapses. Right? What does it do? It transmits impulses to motor neuron from sensory neuron. It transmits impulses from motor neuron to sensory neuron. Right, that's my agester neuron. Next, the next organ that you have in the reflex arc is the motor neuron. The motor neuron is also called as the efferent neuron. It is located in the grey matter of the spinal cord. It is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord, right? Its dendron forms a synapse. Its dendron forms a synapse with the axon of the adjuster neuron. With the axon of the adjuster neuron. Right? And it transmits the impulses to the afferent organ, and it transmits impulses to afferent organ or effector organ through its axon. Right? That's one motor neuron. The last is effector organ. That's the last component of my reflex arc. It may be a muscle or a gland which gives response to a stimulus. It may be a muscle or a gland that gives response to the stimulus. So those are my various components of reflex arc, right? Next, let's see what do you mean by snaps. Snaps. It is a microscopic gap between the axon. It is a microscopic gap between the axon of one neuron. The axon of one neuron and the dendron of another neuron. Right? Present in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Present in gray matter of spinal cord. Present in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Fine. Now what does it do? It helps in transmitting impulses from one neuron to another neuron. It helps in transmitting impulses from one neuron to another. Next, how does it do this? How is the impulse transmitted? The axon manufactures a neurohormone. The axon manufactures a neurohormone. The axon manufactures a neurohormone called acetylcholine, which fills up the gap, to transmit the impulse. transmit the impulse. So you have this neurohormone acetylcholine which fills up this gap between the axon and the dendron, and that's how the impulse is transmitted. Next, an enzyme called cholinesterase. An enzyme called as cholinesterase neutralizes the neurohormone. Acetylcholine at the synapse to prevent the lingering effect of this impulse. The lingering effect of the impulse. Right? Now, let us actually see the mechanism of the reflex action. So these were all the components of the reflex arc. Now, let's see the mechanism of reflex action. Right? As I told you that reflex action takes place through reflex arc. Reflex action takes place through reflex arc. Right? Now the center for reflexes are brain, spinal cord and sympathetic ganglion. Right? The centers for reflexes are the brain, spinal cord and sympathetic ganglia. These are the organs from where reflex action can take place. Now, accordingly, the reflex actions are known as cerebral, spinal, and sympathetic reflex actions. Since there are three centers, depending upon from where your reflex action is taking place, you would have different names for that. If it is taking place from brain, then it is called as cerebral reflex action. If it is taking place from spinal cord, it is called as spinal reflex action. And if it is taking place from the sympathetic ganglia, then it is called as sympathetic reflex action. Right? So I can say accordingly reflex action, the reflex action are known as cerebral, spinal and sympathetic reflex actions. Right? Now, some reflex actions are inborn or unconditional, others are conditional and non-inheritable. Some reflexes are inborn or unconditional, right? So you have some reflex which are inborn and unconditional, others are conditioned and non-inheritable. Others are conditioned and non-inheritable. So these are your different types of reflex action. Now, transmission of impulse takes place through two synapses, one of which is present in between the axon of the sensory neuron and the dendron of the agestry neuron. As I already showed you guys, for transmission of signal you need two synapses. Guys, can you please see this? This is the first snap, this is the other snap. One is between the sensory neuron, that is your axon of the sensory neuron and the dendron of the agester neuron, and the other is the axon of the agester neuron and the dendron of the motor neuron. So you need two such synapses for the transmission of impulse to take place. Fine, do we get this thing here? So I can say that transmission of impulses takes place through two synapses, one of which is present in between the axon of sensory neuron and dendron of the agester neuron. And the other is present between the axon of the agester neuron and the dendron of motor neuron. The other is present between the axon of the agester neuron and dendron of the motor neuron. So you need two synapses for transmission of impulse. The impulse from the sense organ is received by the agester neuron through the sensory neuron. I had already explained this to you guys. I'll just show you this. From the sense organ, you would have the impulse that would go to the agester neuron through the sensory neuron. The sense organ will send the impulse to the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron will send the impulse to the agester neuron. The agester neuron will send the impulse to the motor neuron. The motor neuron will send the impulse to the motor organ. Simple, straightforward path, circular path. Fine, do we get this thing here? So, let's write this down. The impulse from the sense organ, is the impulse from the sense organ is received by the agester neuron. Through sensory neuron. Right? Once you have this, on receiving this impulse, the axon of the sensory and the agester neurons, on receiving the impulse, the axon of the sensory and the agester neuron, axon of sensory and agester neuron secrete a neurohormone secrete a neurohormone called, we already did this, acetylcholine, right? Now this acetylcholine fills up the synapse gap. This acetylcholine fills up the synapse gap. It fills up the synapse gap so that the impulse is further transmitted. So that the impulse is further transmitted to the motor neuron through the second synapse. So that the impulse is further transmitted to the motor neuron through the second synapse. Fine. So now the impulse has been transmitted from the sensory neuron to the adjuster neuron, right? And from the adjuster neuron to the motor neuron. Now the acetylcholine, after transmission of the impulses, gets neutralized. Acetylcholine, after the transmission transmissions of the impulse, gets neutralized by the enzyme called as cholinesterase, to prevent the lingering effect of the impulse. To prevent the lingering effect of the impulse. Fine. Okay. The motor neuron then transmits the impulse to the motor organ. The motor neuron then transmits the impulse to the motor organ, which responds to the impulse. Fine. Now, the motor organ could be a gland or a muscle, and that's how. If it is a gland, it will give us secretion, and if it is a muscle, either it will contract or it will relax. So this is how reflex action takes place, right? Okay, we'll stop this here for the day. Thank you very much.